Scientific writing is a skill that you can train, and you can get better at it by doing it. In the past few years, I noticed that I have various recurring conversations with some of my students about three aspects of scientific writing: the title of a paper, how to structure an abstract, and how to make a writing plan for the main document. In this video clip, I will discuss these three topics briefly, hopefully to help you train this interesting and important skill of writing. Before I go into the content, a word of caution. People, journals, conferences, and disciplines differ a lot in what the hard requirements are of something that you write and what the preferences or suggestions are for what you write. Therefore, I highly encourage that you check the expectations for different assignments, domains, areas, jobs, persons, so your collaborators or supervisors. And please interpret everything I give in this video as tips, heuristics, and food for thoughts, and definitely not as hard requirements that are always true, because they are not. And also, I should maybe say, even though I'm talking about writing, I don't think I'm the best writer in the world. There are definitely better writers, but I've now been doing it for a while and I want to share my experience because I think it's useful to reflect on it. So if you feel like you are not the best writer, don't worry, you can train it, you can get better, and you don't have to be perfect, but you can get better by doing. So on to the content. I will discuss the title and the structuring of your abstract relatively briefly, and then go into a lot more detail about how to structure a writing plan. And I will very briefly at the end say where you can find even more information. I will give some general insights into these elements, but I will also illustrate it with an example article that we wrote ourselves. You can find the link here. It's the main author is one of my former PhD students, Remo van der Heijden. Some of the examples I give are retrofitted to this article, so they are not exactly how we started out, because through the peer review process things change. But I use the article because it's something you can publicly see, and I reflect on how you could do it. So you can lay next to each other what I say with what's in the actual written document. So first I'll think about what the goal might be of the title of a paper. And you can pause the video now if you want to think about it more, because I'm going to give away the answer. I think a answer is that it can help to gain readers' interest in your article. It can communicate the rough topic of your article or thesis or manuscript. And it can help to make it possible to find the article, for example, by search engines. And there can be other goals that your title has. Here are some heuristics. Ideally, I encourage you to use at most one line, definitely for conferences that use big fonts. For the titles, if you have a long title, it takes up a lot of space that you can also spend on content. Make sure that your title is about the content of the paper, so not final report, thesis, but really something that's about your content. It should have the most important keywords or features of your work, and depending on the venue, it can be catchy. Here are some example titles that I like. Right Now, which is about writing that you should do now. So you should do it right now, and you should do the process of writing now. It's very clever. A pace not dictated by electrons, quite a catchy start phrase. And then comes the serious stuff, an empirical study of work without email. This was a paper at a conference. Title stood out, attracted a lot of attention. Cars, Calls, and Cognition, an alliteration. Investigating driving and divided attention, and cars, phone calls, and cognition are the main things that are being looked at in the paper. The adaptation of visual search to utility, ecology, and design. This is a more detailed title, but for people who know this work, it's very clear what it is about because it's so specific in the keywords. Similarly, you can think about the abstract. So what might be the goal of an abstract? So again, you can pause this video if you want to think about it. But here are some of the potential goals of an abstract. It should give a reader a complete and succinct overview of what you did and why you did it, and it should help the reader decide, should I continue to read? Most often, but not always, the goal is not to write an extensive introduction. Sometimes it is for abstracts, but many times it's not. And this is a very common mistake that I've noticed with student writing. The abstract is written as an introduction because it's the first part of the manuscript that you see, but this is not the goal of an abstract. There are again some heuristics for abstracts. Often they are relatively short, around the 150 to 200 maximum words. The American Psychological Association has as a heuristic that the first sentence should describe the core of the article. The objective of this article is, or the contribution of this paper is, this paper does. Each section of your report is typically covered briefly and sometimes very implicitly, but often very explicitly, and I'll show you examples. And typically, there are no irrelevant or too detailed issues discussed. It should really be about the core. And another heuristic is that you want to raise the reader's curiosity. Show why what you did is important, relevant. Why does it matter? Why should people be excited about reading your paper? If you can get that in your abstract, that's a good job. And to be honest, I don't always succeed. Science is sometimes about details, and details can come across as boring. But it might not be. And the more you can radiate excitement in the abstract, that's nice. Because it can help a reader to decide whether they can continue, whether they want to continue with reading your paper after they've read the abstract. So again, often it's not an introduction. So an abstract then has typical elements. You typically write something about every part of the paper. So you write about what your objective is, your goal or your intended contribution, what the context or the motivation is of your work, so something reflecting on the introduction, what the hypothesis or research question might be, what the method is with which you tackle that question, what the main result is, not every result, but the main results, and what the conclusion is and how that can be discussed or interpreted. And sometimes you also talk about the implications or application opportunities. So let's illustrate this with an example paper. So this is the effect of cognitive load on auditory susceptibility during automated driving. Quite a mouthful, that title, but it does have key elements that we wanted to be in the title. This paper was submitted to Human Factors. Human Factors is a very specific requirement for abstracts, namely that the abstract, here I zoom in, has these very specific elements there. They have to be in the abstract. And this might be a bit small on your screen, but again, look up the paper online, look at the paper in detail on another screen maybe, so you can see it in more detail. You don't have to read every word now. So there's these explicit elements, and those are there to help the reader to find specific information, but it's also for you useful as a writer because it forces you not to overlook information. So you write about everything, something, but you can of course also do that implicitly without having to have those explicit elements, objective, background, method, results, conclusion, application there. And I've highlighted here in green some keywords that signal this is what it's about. So the first sentence, we did this. In the background section, there's something about previous work. In the method, 24 participants. Okay, people who participated in an experiment probably. Something about was significantly lower or no effect. Sounds like a result. This can inform, sounds like how it's useful to others. Now you don't need to use the things that I highlighted in yellow here. You can actually rewrite the abstract in a way that it's just shorter. And I actually did that here. In green, I highlighted the elements that I highlighted before in green, and in orange, I rewrote a couple of things to make it more sure. So I left out some text. I said previous work, then I signaled explicitly when we are talking about the results. Results showed that, and I write, we conclude that these results can inform. So really, those are strong signals. This is what it's about. I should write, notice again, Not every writing is perfect. This abstract isn't perfect. The background section is relatively large here. That was also in part due to requests from the peer reviewers that we had to extend a bit of information. So that happens. I make flaws, others make flaws, but I hope it helps you to rewrite your abstract. If I talk about writing an abstract, what many of my students say is, I can't write the abstract because my study is not yet complete. I haven't completed the work. Well, write a fantasy abstract. So imagine everything worked out exactly the way you wanted it. So you've done that experiment or that simulation or that literature review, and the thing that you were looking for, everything just works. What will be the main story? If you can write that down, that gives you focus, and it helps you to articulate the core of your paper, but also the core of each section, because in an abstract, according to how I introduced it, you reflect on each section of the paper. So if you can write it down, you have it somewhere. Now, if you are up for a challenge, you can also write the doom and gloom abstract. So what if everything fails? Is there still something interesting to say? If that is the case, you are probably doing a great study, because independent of the outcome, it's interesting to know what the outcome is. So if you want to challenge yourself, write both abstracts. It really helps to get focus and to think about whether your idea is useful. And if you do it early, it helps you to sharpen your ideas. So now that we've talked about abstract and about title, you can check a document that maybe you've already written. So do you even have a content-based title, or you just say master's thesis or here's the title? Is the abstract something else than an introduction? Does it cover all these elements that I talked about before? And are the sub-elements of the abstract in proportion? So typically each of these elements is 1 to 2 sentences. If you notice that your part of the abstract that is about the introduction is 5 sentences and your result is half a sentence and your interpretation is half a sentence, maybe you need to redo the proportions. Okay, so we talked about title, abstract. Let's now focus on the writing plan. Articles differ in what sections they have. A master's thesis differ in what sections or chapters, if you want, they have. However, there are some commonalities. Typically, there's some introduction. Typically, at some point, there's a discussion of related work or background. Sometimes it's combined with the introduction. There's typically some method, which can be maybe an experiment or a model or simulation or some tool that you developed or some literature review that you did or something else. There's many methods in science. There's typically some result or outcome or observation that you have. And there's typically some discussion. What does that mean? Then there's typically a conclusion that you can draw from that. Let's look at those elements. So for the introduction, that typically gives a broad motivation of why you are doing what you are doing. And I encourage you to use an hourglass method, where within 3 to 5 paragraphs, you go from relatively broad to relatively narrow. So like an hourglass is shaped from broad to narrow. Note that in the very start of the introduction, so by my heuristic, those 3 to 5 paragraphs, you don't talk about every element of context in detail, because those details about the background come in related work. And I'll later talk about how you can structure that. Optional, you can end with sort of a paragraph that gives an overview of what comes after this. And in the example article that we published in Human Factors, we actually did not write that paragraph, but I typically do include it. So I encourage you to write it as well. So you have 3 to 5 paragraphs that introduce what your study is all about, what your work is all about. And then you say, before discussing that in more detail, I'll give you more background on whatever the themes are that come in your background section. We'll talk about that later. Then I'll introduce the experiment and the results, and I'll discuss what that means for whatever is most important that you discuss it for. Okay, so now you have an idea. What do you then do? So typically you have this blank page glooming and staring in front of you. Some writers are very gifted and they just start writing, and I envy those who can write prose right away. But for many other writers, it's not that easy to start writing immediately. And you might think a very long time about that very first sentence to start with. And think about every individual word. I think this is where the writing plan comes in. So try not to just write, but instead use a writing plan. Okay, so what is a writing plan? It's a structured way of saying what are the main claims or arguments that you want to make. What support do you have for each claim? And you can make that plan for each major section of your paper. So for your introduction, you can make a writing plan. For your background section, for your method section, you can make a writing plan. For results and for discussion. Let's look at the introduction of our example article. You go from most broad to most narrow. So there's typically a biggest problem. For example, automation is changing human experience. That's the bigger point we want to make in this paper. There's a smaller problem that automation of vehicles changes the human driving task. And then there's within that a specific or very focused problem, the thing you're really going to tackle. These vehicles have alerts. How does the brain respond to those alerts? Now, with these bigger claims in place, I typically use a bullet point format to expand the text. So I literally write down the claim, automation is changing human experience, and then within it, indented, I write what I want to write next. So I want to give examples that are broader than automated vehicles. And I struggle with the very first sentence that I want to write for this part. So sometimes I just write, here I want to give the broader context. But I'm going to work out what we did for the paper here. I write down which references I want to use. So here I thought, like, well, we had at that time we had recently written a review about human automation interaction with lots of examples. So definitely that one I wanted to cite and use examples from there to illustrate. But I also needed some other examples. So because I was uninspired, want to get on about, well, I need other examples and I need good references for that broader context. But it's the broader context. I'll come back to it. Next point I wanted to make is automations of vehicles changes human driving task. This is already a bit more specific, so it might not be something you can relate to, right? We try to gear towards experts, but we write there are different levels of automation, and the SAE is the Society of Automotive Engineers. We knew we wanted to cite that because they have a structure of how to talk about levels of automation. We then want to explain those levels, and we want to talk about specific levels, SAE level 3 and 4, where alerts might be needed for human assistance, and that those might be auditory alerts. Okay, that's a slightly more specific claim. Then the very specific claim, the vehicles have alerts. How does the brain respond to them? This is where I want to motivate the current study. How does the brain respond to unexpected sounds? That's the research question. So I can literally take a Word document and write down this in a bullet point format. And with something like this, a writing plan can be more extensive than this, of course. You can go to your supervisor or collaborator and discuss it, and they might have feedback. For example, well, you want to give examples broader than automated vehicles. Why don't you talk about airplane pilots? Or why don't you use reference X to talk about these examples? Or when you're talking about the levels, make sure to not overdo this, right? What is super nice of this is that you are not stuck on individual sentences or words. It's short, so it helps you and your supervisor or collaborators to focus on the core. You can really discuss the core. And also, some of the sentences you wrote in your writing plan can be used immediately in your final text. So here's the actual final text of our manuscript. And I've highlighted in green elements that are used from our original writing plan. And notice how the core topics that we chose are also typically at the beginning of the paragraph or close to it. And that's an academic writing heuristic that the so-called topic sentence is often at the beginning or start of the paragraph. And it helps the reader to assess what the main claim is that you want to make in that paragraph. Okay, so we talked about the introduction. Background or related work is sometimes combined with the introduction, but in the style of writing that I prefer, there's an introduction which introduces the work in general, and then there's a related work section that talks about that work in more detail. So what you do here is you think about, well, what are the broader themes or topics that you want to discuss? What's like a bigger thing of which you really need to describe what's been done in the past? So for the paper, example paper, we talk about the frontal P3 component as a measure of susceptibility, something very detailed, but that was important for the paper. But it could also be that you say, well, I want to talk about human attention, I want to talk about levels of automation, and I want to talk about alerts, right? This really depends on your domain that you're working on, but each of these themes should be slightly bigger. What I then recommend to you is that within your background section, each theme you give its own subheader. And within that subsection, you talk about that theme. So what are the things that you want to discuss in more depth that you want to think about? And typically you have 3 to 5 points that you want to say. And for each of those points, you can think about how do you support each of those points, so you make a writing plan. Now, what I've sometimes have seen with students is that there are 10 themes and each theme has one paragraph. Well, then you are just having isolated paragraph, isolated points. So if that's what you find yourself do, rethink what is the bigger thing that I want to say. So typically a subsection is 3 to 5 paragraphs. These are all heuristics. It can be 10 if you need 10. It can be 2 if you need 2. But if you find yourself writing short paragraphs of just one, you're probably not focusing on the bigger thing. When you have that writing plan, you can again go to your supervisor, right? So what are the bigger themes? Have you maybe missed a theme? Is some information missing? Where is the argument maybe incomplete? What knowledge are you missing? Is the flow correct, right? Is the way that you go from one sub-theme to the next, is that the logical order? Should you go from attention to levels of automation to alerts, or from attention to alerts to levels of automation, or from levels of automation to alerts to attention, right? You can think about the more bigger picture order of information. Then a tip, I recommend that you end your background or related work section with some more detailed overview or motivation of what comes next. So why are you doing this specific experiment? Given that you've now described in detail what previous work has done, you've already said in your introduction why you're doing this specific work, but now you can say it in a lot more detail in the context of hypotheses. Or what is the specific research question or hypothesis that you have, given that you've laid out in detail what previous work has done. So here's again a subsection of the paper. Here we have just one theme, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs. So it's quite detailed. This was because the journal limited us in how we could structure it, the total length of the article, and this was a logical structure that we wanted. We have one section that's about frontal P3 as a measure of susceptibility, but we still had that other section about study aim and hypothesis, where, given that we've now described a lot of detailed information, we give specific hypotheses that we can then test and report on in the method section. So that was the background related work section. Method, it really differs between studies what the method is, right? But there is always some method. And even though I talk about it sort of linearly through the paper, abstract, intro, background, method, for many writers, the method section is the thing they want to start with, because it's something where you've thought about the details, the experiment that you did. So it's something that feels comfortable. You don't need to embed it a lot in previous work, because it should be very clear cut, like this is what I did. I did that first, then this, then that. That said, this is a great section to write before you actually did that experiment or study. As putting your thoughts in writing helps to think about whether you overlooked something, and again, you can use that to talk with your collaborators or supervisors and see whether there are any holes in your methods. And How a method section is structured differs a lot between studies, but here are some of my preferences. For an experiment, psychological experiment, I recommend looking at the American Psychological Association publication manual. I typically have the following subsection: the participants, who took part in your study, what are their characteristics, what materials did you use, what types of computers or simulators, what types of tasks did you run on those materials, what was the design, what is the thing that you manipulated in the experiment, was it between subjects, within subjects, how did you control for certain things, what's the procedure given your design, given your task, given your participants. Now, if you've already described your task in detail, you can really say the procedure in like 10 sentences, as if how you would explain it to a participant. First, participants came in, they got an instruction, then we signed consent form, then we applied electrodes, then they did one practice trial, then we did 20 experimental trials, and afterwards they had a questionnaire and debriefing. In total, it took 1 hour, something like that. After the procedure section, you can talk about the analysis. How do you approach the analysis? Or for ERP studies, how do you do the pre-processing, for example, of the EEG data? And you can look at the example paper on how we did it there. For a cognitive model paper, I typically like to write about what's the structure of the model, what are the major components that we need to talk about, what was the procedure, how did you run the model, how many simulations, and what were critical parameter settings. And here's another paper that if you are a student working with me or with someone else on how to do a simulation, cognitive model, maybe this is a place to look at for inspiration, but there's of course many other papers that have great modeling work. For the results section of your paper, this can really differ between different types of papers, but really make sure to think about what your main result is. And again, you can do this before you've run a study. What type of data might you, for example, want to make a graph of? What's the main thing you want to show, right? If you say I test something between two groups, probably your graph should reflect a result of both groups. Again, the more structure you can give this, the better. Notice that I say what you want to think about, what might the result look like. Of course, you should not write the paper with made up results and made up arguments, but I'm trying to make explicit that you really want to think of the rationale of why are you doing what you're doing. And again, if you have an idea of what the result might look like, what your hypothesis is about it, and how you might visualize it in the graph, that's something to discuss with your supervisor before you start doing the study. Once the results are presented, you typically want to contextualize that in a discussion, and you want to have a conclusion. In a discussion or general discussion, I typically like to distinguish the following elements, and I encourage students always to have subheaders for each element to make sure that they don't overlook it. So first, start with the summary of results. This is not a repetition of all the p-values or all the means, but it is a high-level summary of what you found, and you discuss that in the context of previous literature. So in a sense, you're mimicking the introduction and the background. What can the authors that you cited in your introduction learn from your work? What nuance, what refinement have you created? After that, you can talk about what that means. What are the implications? And it depends on the type of paper you're writing, what type of implication you want to do within human-computer interaction. Sometimes there are implications for theory. Sometimes there are implications for practice or for design. Sometimes there are both. Sometimes I work with students who intern at a company, and you might want to talk about what the implication is for the company. Why not make that very explicit with the subheader? Implications for the company, right? So the manager can easily find it in your manuscript. There's always some limitations on studies, and I am a proponent of making that very explicit. Some people say their studies are perfect and there aren't limitations. I'm sure they are doing great work, but there are typically things that you tested and you didn't test, and you did it for good reasons, but it's always useful to make that explicit. And in a limitation section, you can do that. And in a future work section, you can more look forward to, well, maybe there's some limitation, but how can you test that, or can someone else test that in future work? I always like to end with a conclusion, sort of a bang. Make sure that your conclusion doesn't become a general discussion where you discuss everything again. Instead, think about what is your main conclusion or takeaway and say it in 3 to 5 sentences. And avoid making this a discussion. Okay, so I talked about the title, the abstract, a writing plan. Where can you find more information? Well, one thing to do is to read other papers for examples of how you can structure your text, right? It differs between journals and between conferences how text is structured, so it's really useful to read other papers, not just for the content, but also for how do they approach writing. There's also 2 articles that I really like that explicitly talk about the writing process. I like the article Right Now by Harold Thimbleby. If you search for Thimbleby right now, you can find it on Google, as it really talks about why you want to start writing and why you shouldn't overthink everything, why it's so useful to start writing early. I also like his introduction of a junk section in the paper. I always use a junk section. Really good recommendation. For experimental work, I like this article by Paul Kearns. It's on an online platform, interactiondesign.org. There's literature, and you can just view the HTML. Paul talks about why you want to write up your introduction, your method section, and your sort of ideas for graphs or ideas for analyses before you even do the study. So this is what I also talked about in this presentation. I got inspiration about that from this great article, so I encourage you to read it. If you are at Utrecht University, there's a skills lab, and I encourage you to look up the skills lab. There are lots of courses on writing, and all my students that went to writing courses, they always returned super enthusiastic. If you're at another university, I hope you also have a skills lab, but I'm sure there is. Okay, so we talked about title, abstract, and writing plan. I hope these tips are useful. Good luck with your writing. If you are working with me on a writing project, I hope you take the advice to heart and use it to write your paper.